Hello, and welcome back. We are wrapping up the Networking Field Day experience at Aruba Atmosphere Digital in the way that we love to wrap up all of our Aruba Atmosphere with a panel discussion. We have 8 of the best and brightest delegates across networking, security, and wireless here with us. And it wouldn't be right if we didn't get a chance to kind of sit down around a virtual table and just kind of talk about some of the things that we've learned and heard from this week, and maybe have an opportunity just to get some ideas out there, to get some feeling about how things are. So I'm going to go ahead and go around real quick so that everybody can get a quick round of introductions so you know who the panelists are, and then we'll launch into our first topic. So Mitch, why don't you go ahead and start?
Well, I'm Mitch Dickey, work for a large school district in Northern Virginia. My Twitter handle is @badger_phi, and my website is badger-phi.com. I've been doing this now for, wireless specifically for almost 10 years, and I've been in the network industry since roughly 2003. So CWNE, and do mostly Wi-Fi and route switch.
Awesome. Drew?
Hi, I'm Drew Connery Murray. I'm on Twitter @Drew_CM. I write about networking and IT over at Packet Pushers.
Thank you. Nick?
Nick Shoemaker, wireless practice lead for a network integration VAR. Twitter is @inshoe18. Website is wirelessnick.com, and been doing wireless and route switch for, about 20 years now.
JJ?
Hey, Jennifer Manella, or JJ, VP of Engineering and Security at Carolina Advanced Digital. We're an integrator specializing in wireless and any network security technologies. I am @JJX on Twitter. And sometimes you can find me at securitymcorp.com, sometimes not.
Awesome. Jennifer Huber?
Hi, you can find me on Twitter at Jennifer Lucille. My website's also jenniferlucille.com. Log in frequently. It depends on all the things. I've been in the Wi-Fi space for about 20 years, same as Nick. Work for a large VAR out of St. Louis, but I'm out of Tampa. And yeah, that's it.
Thank you. Jason?
Hi, my name is Jason Bashara. You can find me at Jason Bashara at twitter.com. I'm a mobility solutions architect. I work for a company named Velispan. I've been doing Wi-Fi and route switch since probably about 2000.
All right. JD?
Hey folks, Jonathan Davis, or JD here. I am on Twitter @subnetwork. Also, the blog is subnetwork.me. I have about 20 years in IT, a little over 20 years in IT, and about 12 of that is in wireless. I work for a large municipality where, as a senior network engineer, where I spend a lot of time in either kind of 2 disparate areas, either BGP internet or Wi-Fi.
Awesome. And Keith?
Hi, Keith Parsons here. I run a little company called Wireless Lamp Professionals. We do blogging at WLAN Pros. On Twitter, I'm Keith R. Parsons, and been doing this for about 20 years and focused just on Wi-Fi. Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us today. We've had a lot of great presentations that we've heard from our friends here at Aruba around security, around wireless. But we've also had a couple of days of Aruba Atmosphere over the last, Tuesday and Wednesday. We had some great keynotes. We heard a lot of great new technologies. Aruba's Edge Services platform is probably the one thing that really stood out through this whole presentation that we've seen. And it's interesting because Aruba is trying to redefine what the edge means. I mean, when you think about it, we've always thought of the edge of the network as maybe switches or routers, or depending on how much work you've done, maybe even an end host. But when we look at what the edge of the network really means now, a lot of it comes back to things like IoT. And how do we secure those things? How do we connect them? If you think about a hospital, there's a lot of things that are hanging out on the edge that we're going to have to deal with. So I want to talk about what the new edge looks like. And we had some great presentations today from the team talking about things like the Kate Network sensors, which have been integrated into the Aruba Networks line, being able to collect analytics and things like that to feed into a bigger platform for ESP. I mean, I'm going to throw the question out there. What does the new edge of the network look like for you? I'll start with Nick. You kind of touch this stuff on a daily basis working for a VAR. What are you seeing the customers that you work with looking at when they define their edge, Nick?
Yeah, I think like you said, the edge is definitely different from what we saw today, especially in our current environment. The edge is more devices at home, putting remote access points, remote devices, things like that. But even especially doing a lot of Aruba that we do, having the layer 7 capabilities at the access point as opposed to having to go back into the core of the network and all of that. We're actually pushing a lot of that functionality directly to where the clients are connecting, and with the switching and with the sensors and everything else that's coming out now and the ESP, it's going to make that just a complete game changer of how we handle a device plugging into a network. What is it doing, and we're going to do that at the port level as opposed to in the core like we have been for who knows how many years.
Yeah, and I especially liked the fact that Partha called out the fact that an access point is no longer just an access point. When in his tech keynote yesterday, he talked about the fact that it's a platform now. It's not just providing radio beacons on Wi-Fi. It's providing analytics support. It's providing security support. It really is basically, when you think about it, an edge compute node that just happens to be broadcasting wirelessly. So Keith, you've had a lot of experience with APs over the years. I mean, you go all the way back to the beginning of Wi-Fi. How do you see this being transformative? How do you see APs kind of being that new delivery mechanism for so many other services instead of just wireless?
Well, thank you for highlighting my gray hair that has been around that long. Thank you. But yeah, I've seen APs go from being fat to thin to fat again. There's been a transition over and over again. Even Aruba from their inception was very focused on security at the AP level, kind of like what Nick said, you're going to push the firewall right to the edge. But what I see, especially this last year, maybe the last 2 years, as HP and Aruba have kind of melded together, is they've taken Aruba's focus on the security part and taken it from the edge, but they brought back in the Aruba pieces back into the switch and back into the core as well. And now, like you said, they're taking that back out again. That since we all realize, and it's been years in coming, Wi-Fi is the edge of our network. But there are still things like some IoT devices, not just wireless IoT, but plugged-in IoT that have to be controlled and secured and watched. And so some of the sessions we saw this week allowed us to see that you could apply the same policies to something that starts in the air, comes over a Wi-Fi, or starts in a wired port, or someplace in between, and they can all have the same type of policy attached to them. So I think this move to the edge is just the part of our network that devices connect to, and it's just getting broader and broader.
It's an interesting perspective. JJ, you've always come at this kind of from a security background as well. I mean, how do you see the AP kind of fitting in as a security tool as well as a connectivity tool?
Well, I think, you mentioned a second ago in one of the keynotes where they talked about AP being a platform. And I think really the entire infrastructure, what we've heard in the past few days is the entire infrastructure now is a platform. We heard about the analytics agents that are sitting within the APs, but also the CX switching and the new branch gateways. So it's kind of this like ecosystem now that's a lot. I hate the word holistic when it comes to IT things, but there's some value to that phrase, and it is really more holistic. And we've talked about in security for a long time the expanding or dissolving perimeter, which I think you mentioned a minute ago. So, pushing this out to the edge and redefining what the edge is really beyond a marketing term and a phrase at this point, because we have to, with IoT and all of these other things, regardless of how they're connected, we have to start. And to answer your question about AP, I don't think it's just APs. I think it's all of the infrastructure now. Every port, wired or wireless, now needs to participate and start making those intelligent decisions or feeding data for intelligent decisions.
And I think we've seen that with what Aruba is really trying to do. One of the presentations we had earlier today was about the unified network. They no longer look at it as wired versus wireless. It's one network, whether you're plugged in or you're roaming around. And you can push the same policies no matter what you're doing because they look at it from a user-centric perspective. So yeah, I would totally agree there that everything has to come together, because if it doesn't, we're going to have this ships in the night type of network that's going to end up causing problems in the long run because nothing really works right. Now, Mitch, you work in a school district, so you have an interesting client mix compared to the rest of us. I kind of want to get your thoughts on some of this idea of what the new edge looks like, because I can remember trying to hook up things like projectors or, some pretty interesting smart boards. And well, there's probably a reason why I don't have any hair left on the top of my head. How do you see that transforming your environment?
Well, that is true. There's all kinds of devices these days. A lot of them that, in my particular case, I'm not responsible for. It's just providing the access to those devices. But I mean, just like they mentioned today, just IoT devices that now rely on access, and just like they talked about door locks or HVAC systems. Actually, I wrote about that not too long ago before Christmas. Anything and everything can attach to the network at this point. So, I mean, I have to work with all different departments inside of the school system to allow access for boilers or security systems or, you name it. And you have to be ready for any of it at any time. So, and it's important that when you are ready for anything and everything, that it can be secure. So being able to extend the security from end to end is really important. And in my situation, like I said, it could be anything. Like we don't limit what people can bring as far as their BYOD device. I mean, so you just got to be ready for it.
Yeah, BYOD is a huge driver for a lot of things because, I can remember back when I first started in IT, it's like, oh, well, we get the corporate laptop and you should be lucky to have that. And now everyone's like, no, I'm going to bring my own MacBook and I'm going to bring my iPad and I'm going to bring these 14 other things that I need to connect and you better make them all work. Right. Jennifer, you work for a large VAR, and I'm sure you've seen some very interesting use cases in a bunch of different verticals. I mean, what does the edge mean to you?
Well, I've seen a lot of customers talk about wanting to get data and analytics from the edge. So whether it be putting containers on routers at the edge so that you can do the analytics closer to where the sensors are, rather than having that data come all the way back to a dashboard. I've seen that equally, just like I've seen customers want to go cloud first for everything and have everything, just put it all in one dashboard, much like we're seeing with the evolvement of Aruba Central being cloud focused.
Yeah, I think we're definitely going to get to talk about Aruba Central here in a minute. I want to make sure that Eddie Ferrero, who's probably watching out there, is happy that we talked about Aruba Central. But yeah, I would agree that it's interesting to kind of see how people are starting to lean that direction. That that we used to be, we had the clearly defined core, and then we radiated out from there, and now it's the edge in the cloud, and that's kind of weird. But one of the things that I think is actually kind of interesting, and I'm going to call on Drew as like the only non-wireless person here. The edge of the network is now being serviced by SD-WAN, or in Aruba's case, they refer to it as SD-Branch. They use a different terminology because of the inheritance that they got from it. I mean, I know that a lot of people, especially with the beginning of the current pandemic and how it's affected their ability to work both, at home and even from kind of clustered office areas. What does SD-Branch mean for the edge of the network? How is SD-WAN, that's this idea, enabling us to transform our edge, really?
I mean, the first thing I want to say is, being a little bit cynical, I feel like edge is defined as whatever a vendor has in their portfolio that's not data center or campus. So let's get that out of the way. But I guess I feel like SD-WAN is taking remote access and making it more flexible and actually giving you more policy options around it. That's the value proposition, as opposed to just having sort of this blank VPN tunnel, which you just chuck everything through. Having that application identification capabilities in SD-WAN or SD-Branch gives you more opportunity to say, prioritize this over that and like with voice or whatever, people having Zoom meetings like everyone's doing now. SD-WAN gives you more fine-grained ability to do things like QoS and security. So I think that's how it dovetails nicely with this work from home trend that we're seeing right now.
I'll tell you, the last month or so, I really could have used some kind of an intelligent application recognition system in my home network, because we had 3 Zoom meetings going on at once, and the kids wanted to download the latest update for a game console. And well, it didn't work out so well for somebody's Zoom call, and it would have been nice to be like, no, we can put that off a little bit. But I think that the application inspection part that you talked about is really important, because that kind of speaks into the analytics that we've kind of been touching on. The more information you have about everything that's going on, whether it's in the branch, at the edge, or in the cloud, it allows us to build on all of these ideas and create more capability. Now, Jason, you haven't had a chance to speak up here. I want to give you a chance to kind of tell me what you define the new edge to look like.
So for me, the edge is where the magic happens, right? That's where your users live. And it's all about that user experience, whether you're being in the home right now, as most of us are, the different verticals, whether for medical or industrial with IoT sensors. That is super important. The integration that you're able to do now with some of the APs and their platforms, like the 802.15 radios that we talked about earlier in APs, being able to build on that and provide additional services for those widgets, I think that's going to be a game changer in the industry.
Yeah, you had to bring up the big bad 802.15, which, if I remember correctly from reading some of JD's blog posts, that's Zigbee, right, JD?
Well, the funny thing about that is Zigbee is built on 802.15.4, but there are actually quite a few protocols that are built on it, right? So, and that's what's interesting about them being very clear about calling it an 802.15.4 radio. And then additionally calling out Zigbee, is it definitely seems like really any protocol that follows that 802.15.4 standard should at some point they should be able to kind of create the software hooks for it, right? So that's really kind of an interesting note that as I've heard them discuss that both at Mobility Field Day and again today. They're being very intentional there, and so I'm really curious to see what happens there. Zigbee is absolutely one of those situations where it can become. We've seen obviously quite a few exploits and things. If you look at any of the security conferences for Zigbee and really any of those, and so being able to interact with those devices on the same platform and the same access points. Again, it goes back to what we're already talking about. Is it's redefining that edge, right? And I think that the important point too here is it's not just about the information on what's connected; it's about control of what's connected, right? So it's moving that control point as close to those devices as possible, so that if it's a device that should not be connecting the network, it's the end device telling that refusing to allow connection, not some higher level system that it's already allowing that device onto the network, right? And so it's this disaggregation of the information that's being fed northbound and the control that's being fed southbound generally, to those individual components. And that's when it becomes safe, and that's when it becomes it will be easy and more commonplace to bring Zigbee and other 802.15.4 clients into the network, because based on what we know, most of those clients are very low cost as far as the way they're built, which means they're not built for security. Let's be very clear about that. They are not built for security. So if we don't control that, then we are absolutely opening ourselves up to some just for whatever exploit happens to be out there.
Yeah, I think you're right about that, because one of the things that I've seen, I follow some folks who do some home automation. In fact, a couple of people who have been featured on Field Day in the past, Carlo Costanzo and Chris Young, are both huge into the home automation space. And I hear those kinds of echoes all over again. It's like, this would be a great device if it wasn't wide open to the world and completely, exploitable. And I'm like, I don't want to put that thing in my house. But then I think about, well, is this something that we can use this edge from Aruba to do? Can we implement security in unsecure devices? I mean, we started talking about zero trust in the last session, and I kind of like the idea of, the device is like, oh yeah, you can trust me. What's the worst thing that can happen? And the network going, I have a list of things, and no, I'm not going to trust you. So, I mean, is this kind of what we're looking at as the new edge? Is kind of a perimeter of, I'll let you on, but I don't trust you. I'll collect data to make sure you're doing what you're saying you're doing. And then I'll allow you to go places that I think you need to go, but prevent you from going places I know you shouldn't be going.
I think you just defined it, that we have to let the devices on, but we need our edge of our network to be better at tracking those and making those decisions. We need to trust that it's making the correct decisions. One of the sessions we just had showed some examples where two different Raspberry Pis, they were both had the same MAC address. They looked the same on the network, but because of some AI and some machine learning, they were able to differentiate between one that could go someplace and one that shouldn't go someplace, and able to keep those separate. Even though they were in the same subnet, they still had different rules and roles applied to them.
Yeah. And that's one of the things I remember talking to some of the Aruba folks, it's been a couple of years ago. And just the idea of, what does a payment terminal look like when it joins the Wi-Fi? And why should a payment terminal ever have to talk to the HVAC system? And by now, that's a pretty apocryphal story of a hack that happened to a large major retailer. But, these are the kinds of things we have to think about. We have to be able to define devices, but we have to understand the devices before we can define them. Why does this Nintendo Switch suddenly need to contact this server? Oh, well, it's a new game that we downloaded and it's going to talk to a different developer's server versus, no, it should definitely not be accessing classified documentation on the internal hospital network or something like that. So, I completely agree with you, Keith, there. That's one of the things that we definitely need to be cognizant of.
It feels like we've been trying to solve this problem for a long time. Like we had NAC back in the day, but especially with IoT, you can't give everybody an 802.1x client, credential. So I think what we're learning is, and if we want to bring this back to Aruba, what they're doing is saying we need the entire network. We need APs, we need switches, we need policy control layers, we need devices that are watching flow data and seeing how applications are talking to get a real picture of what this actual device is. We need to confirm that it is what it is that it's saying and not spoofing, and then be able to take all of this information, provide some context around it, and then be able to use that context to start applying layered policies. So it's not just finding one place at the network, the edge, but using the entire network and all the context you can get from different modalities to inform and then push out policy.
And I think that started this week when KRT first started. In one of his slides that I sent out on a Twitter message was define your edge. So Aruba is allowing you, if you go with their whole full stack, to have the edge inside, outside, anywhere. But your situation, like Mitch, might not need all the same edge that someone else does if it's in the corporate environment. So I like the idea that it's up to you to make the correct decision on where that's going to be.
Well, and that's where I think we have. This has nothing to do with any manufacturer. This has to do with those of us, everybody using the technologies. We have repeatedly failed at each of these technologies leading up to this point, right? I know our company started doing SDN many, many years ago. That's still not fully baked. Nobody's quite got that right from the manufacturer standpoint and from the implementation standpoint. Network access control, which is still around, Drew. We're doing that, but it's almost, it kind of went through this, okay, we know we need to do it, because we've been doing this for 15 years. A lot of it was, we know we need to do it, but the execution was so poor because of the organizations didn't know how. They didn't know how to do discovery. They didn't know how to figure out what was on the environment, that all the stuff we're kind of solving now a little bit better. things like UEBA, things like, behavior analytics and things that weren't signature based. We have repeatedly kind of failed implementing these things individually. Now, I have hope that we're kind of putting these together and they're going to kind of mesh and bring in intelligence, especially with this machine learning. But the humans haven't been making the right decisions about these things. We haven't been doing the right implementation, the right profiling, the right application of these technologies and adopting them and changing. I think, I don't want to go down a rabbit hole here, but I think as technologists, we're always kind of in firefighting mode. And a lot of the things we've talked about requires us to shift gears, to stop, to pause, to think completely differently and implement things differently. And I think now we kind of have some ways to do that incrementally that we didn't have before. And we have a little bit broader adoption. And we have the weight of a company, like Aruba with HPE that has some volume and some mass and some resources to help us with that.
I think you bring up a really good point. A lot of the implementation falls to the people doing the work, right? And kind of the difference now is that I think the problem where a lot of it was broken in the past was, even if it was implemented well, even if device classification, all of your devices on your network were classified. They were classified that day, right? And they had rules that were correct for that day. But then 3 months down the road and 6 months down the road and a year down the road, is that still the case? And a lot of times that wasn't the case. So one of the, when they began talking, when Aruba talked about zero trust security today, they really talked about, kind of 5 pieces of it: the visibility, the authentication, the role-based access control. But the important 2 points were the continuous monitoring, right? And then the enforcement and response, right? So having the ML or AI, whatever you want to call it, taking care of that, right? That day-to-day monitoring and ensuring that that the definitions are kept up to date as far as the device definitions and the fingerprints and things along those lines. That's really the important point, and that's where a lot of times this has failed and been broken in the past. And I think that's most important now, as we see that that going back to the edge. The edge doesn't exist where it did 6 months ago. In a lot of cases, when I worked previously, I worked for a very large manufacturing, global manufacturing company, and I would go set up these remote locations, and often one of the first steps was a physical security audit, right? And there was a good reason to do that at that point, but we can't do that at every employee's home where every single employee is connected. So that continuous monitoring and that fingerprinting of devices is what really allows the intelligence and the product features to do what they're supposed to do. If without that, I mean, you would need a ridiculously large staff doing nothing but the monitoring to ever actually be able to say that you had a secure edge.
And I wanted to just jump in with one add-on to that, which is that the other problem, because we have all of this stuff related to the endpoints, right? But then the other problem is organizational, organizational policy stuff and organizational ownership. So I kind of, in our chat, we were talking about, and I was mentioning some CMDB stuff, because the other thing people have to keep up with is who owns that device from a inside the organization standpoint. Who owns it? Who's responsible for it? Who's maintaining it? What data is on it? Because that defines how we classify it for compliance and regulation in the security space. So there's this complexity of the user and the endpoint, and then where it is, the network stuff. But then there's all of this other organizational things we haven't really figured out a good solution to yet.
Yeah, and this is the problem. Just to go back to something you said earlier, JJ, I think part of the problem is that the solutions that we've come up with haven't been focused. They have been boil the ocean solutions, whether it's NAC or SDN or something like that. This will fix all of your problems. All of these nails we can hammer down, except we're now dealing with screws and railroad spikes and possibly even some weird epoxy type stuff. No one thing fits all of these problems. And we talk about it in security all the time. It needs to be defense in depth. It needs to be something that is not easily defeated. But I would argue that it also needs to be something that is very directed at connectivity, directed at security, directed at enablement, in order to make sure that we're using it appropriately. You know, a lot of the technologies that we've talked about, NAC, SDN, I don't know, go all the way back to asynchronous transfer mode. they work really well for what they were designed to work for. It's when people's trying to break them out of that it becomes a problem. And so, maybe that's the key, is once we've defined what this new edge is supposed to look like, we can start winnowing out the protocols we don't need in order to make everything work the way we would like it to, with a healthy dose of security and analytics to make sure that it's all safe and it's working the way we expect it to.
Yeah, I just want to add something here. And the other thing is with all of this stuff that the edge now has to account for, there's so many variables that come along with all these devices. And then being able to re-identify or reclassify these devices whenever they get new drivers or whatever, because the behavior of these devices can change, like a little bit like JD was saying. I mean, just because they behave one way today doesn't necessarily going to mean they're going to behave the same next week or however. So something that's doing constant monitoring in the environment, I think, is critical. And just because of the influx of these devices, and many of these IoT devices, and even further than that, some of those people are just really good at doing, making boilers, but they're not really good at integrating their boiler onto the network. So that thing is just, it's just, there's such a dynamic range of devices, and being able to adapt and make sure that those devices have access and are secure I think it's really critical.
Well, and I think the proliferation that we've seen of those devices over the last even just 3 years compared to what it was. I mean,
absolutely,
that's why the edge has had to come out. I mean, we've got some higher education customers, and for the most part, it's, you're bringing Xboxes and printers, and the students are setting them up on their own or whatever. And now all of a sudden, I've got all of the, I've got the iPad or the control systems that all of the different meeting rooms where I'm scheduling everything, which is tied back into the network, which has to get updates, which has to stay online, and just that constant constant connectivity of all that stuff. And like you said, how do you keep it up to date? How do you know it's got the right patches? And then how do I know somebody hasn't, swapped it out? Again, it's every single day you got to figure it out. It's not a one-time thing anymore.
So I'm going to ask the delegates here. I want you to get out your crystal ball, and I want you to think about what the edge is going to look like in 2 more years. I mean, we all admit that when we made our 5-year plan in 2015, we kind of blew it. But again, that's the magic of the future. It's always moving, so we were never really sure. Who wants to jump out here and give me a prognostication of what they think the edge is going to look like in 2 years?
I'll jump into that because I've been thinking about it quite a bit. I think what we're going to begin to see is we're going to begin to see more of the actual processing of the data and more ML functionality at the edge, right? So we're actually going to see dedicated hardware in these devices that can do a lot of that classification. Not that dissimilar when you think about it from the chipsets that are in, like the Apple iPhones, for example, right, where they're doing all of that processing. They're already doing ML on devices. So I think we're going to see a whole lot more of that that custom silicon in the hardware, so that rather than having to do anything that involves going to the cloud and back or what have you, that things can be pre-classified and pre-qualified, as close to the edges. So I think we're going to continue to see that disaggregation of processing all the way to the very edge, so that decisions are being made there. And we're going to see less decisions being made in a cloud platform or dashboard of some sort.
Anyone else?
I'll take the shot here. I think I'm going to disagree with a lot of people in saying I think 2 years from now the edge will be worse than it is today. We'll be getting more and more cheaper devices that have less capabilities, and they still want to be on our networks. And so we're going to have to find, we talked today and the last couple of days about some solutions, but I think it's the proliferation of cheap devices is going to make this even more difficult moving forward. If you just think of how many devices in your home are on the network versus what they are today versus what they're going to be 2 years from now, I think this problem is just going to get worse and worse.
I don't think you're wrong. For every great next VR headset or augmented reality glasses that come from a manufacturer, we're going to end up with a whole bunch of crappy, cheap 2.4 gigahertz radios that kind of halfway work and don't really pay attention to anything. So.
Yeah, and did you notice today in one of the demos, they said VR needs 200 megs cleanly.
Huh.
Yeah. So and you know your kids are going to want to play your Switch with the VR on, and then it's going to be your fault because you didn't meet the SLA.
Anyone else have any thoughts on what the Edge is going to look like?
A real quick follow-up. I will say I absolutely agree with Keith on that. When I'm referring to Edge, I think we're going to see that in our access points and switches, more of that ML processing taking place in those devices, because Keith is absolutely right. The devices, I have no hope for the future when it comes to those end devices.
But wouldn't it be nice if we could get the intelligence all the way to the edge and have those even just in a edu environment where if you brought something from home, it had .1x in it already? Just a little thing like that would be hugely helpful.
Why would you need that with Enhanced Open?
Okay, get out.
I, for one, am actually hoping Keith is wrong, and in 2 years we start to see the adoption and the uptick of Wi-Fi 6E. So we don't see a lot of those, what we say, the crappy radios out there, the cheap radios that are deployed today in state-of-the-art medical devices. Right? I've been in the medical vertical where you look at a brand new scope. And brand new scope that's $150,000, $200,000 has a 2.4 BG radio in it.
So part of the problem there is those devices, when they clear FDA, right, they actually have to clear the FDA with that device. And even changing the radio requires recertification through the FDA. So that's one of those problems that we see, and of course we also see plenty of manufacturers who simply put in a component and they build that device basically until they can't any longer, right? So there's kind of two sides to that, but the fact that we're still seeing that, if anything, suggests that 2 years from now, as much as excited as I am about 6E, I think we're still going to be dealing with the exact same problems, and I think if anything, as much as I love Raspberry Pis and the single board computers and all of the things that they have made possible, they've also created this mindset of the end devices should be cheap and should be throwaway. And generally, people don't put good radios and with good capabilities in cheap devices.